Well, the peace of the house was destroyed, though there was quiet. Days passed and she asked no questions, though now she was deep into books of the occult, of witches and witchcraft, and of vampires. This was mostly fancy, you understand. Myths, tales, sometimes mere romantic horror tales. But she read it all. Till dawn she read, so that I had to go and collect her and bring her to bed. Lestat, meantime, hired a butler and maid, and had a team of workers in to make a great fountain in the courtyard, with a stone nymph pouring water eternal from a wide-mouthed shell. He had goldfish brought, and boxes of rooted water-lilies set into the fountain, so their blossoms rested upon the surface and shivered in the ever-moving water. A woman had seen him kill on the Nyadis road, which ran into the town of Carrollton, and there were stories of it in the papers, associating him with a haunted house near Nyades, actually I assume that's how it's pronounced, near Nyades and Melpomene, all of which delighted him. He was the Nyades Road ghost for some time, though it finally fell to the back pages, and then he performed another grisly murder in another public place, and set the imagination of New Orleans to working. But all this had about it some quality of fear. He was pensive, suspicious, drew close to me constantly to ask where Claudia was, where she'd gone, and what she was doing. "She'll be all right," I assured him, though I was estranged from her and in agony, as if she'd been my bride. She hardly saw me now, as she'd not seen Lestat before, and she might walk away when I spoke to her. "She had better be all right," he said nastily. "And what will you do if she's not?" I asked, more in fear than accusation. He looked up at me with his cold grey eyes. "You take care of her, Louis. You talk to her," he said. "Everything was perfect, and now this. There's no need for it." But it was my choice to let her come to me, and she did. It was early one evening when I had just awakened. The house was dark. I saw her standing by the French windows. She wore puffed sleeves and a pink sash, and was watching with lowered lashes the evening rush in the Rue Royale. I could hear Lestat in his room, the sound of water splashing from his pitcher. The faint smell of his cologne came and went like the sound of music from the cafe 2 doors down from us. "He'll tell me nothing," she said softly. I hadn't realized she knew that I had opened my eyes. I came towards her and knelt beside her. "You'll tell me, won't you? How it was done?" "Is this what you truly want to know?" I asked, searching her face. "Or is it why it was done to you, and what you were before? I don't understand what you mean by how, for if you mean how it was done so that in turn you may do it—" "I don't even know what it is. What you're saying," she said with a touch of coldness. Then she turned full around and put her hands on my face. "Kill with me tonight," she whispered as sensuously as a lover, "and tell me all that you know. What are we? Why are we not like them?" She looked down into the street. "I don't know the answers to your questions," I said to her. Her face contorted suddenly as if she were straining to hear me over a sudden noise, and then she shook her head, but I went on. "I wonder the same things you wonder. I do not know how I was made. I'll tell you that. How I was made, I'll tell you that Lestat did it to me, but the real how of it I don't know." Her face had the same look of strain. I was seeing in it the first traces of fear, or something worse and deeper than fear. "Claudia," I said to her, putting my hands over her hands and pressing them gently to my skin. "Lestat has one wise thing to tell you. Don't ask these questions. You've been my companion for countless years in my search for all that I could learn of mortal life and mortal creation. Don't be my companion now in this anxiety. He can't give us the answers, and I have none." I could see she could not accept this. But I hadn't expected the convulsive turning away, the violence with which she tore down at her hair for an instant and then stopped as if the gesture were useless, stupid. It filled me with apprehension. She was looking at the sky. It was smoky, starless, the clouds blowing fast from the direction of the river. She made a sudden movement of her lips as if she'd bitten into them. Then she turned to me and, still whispering, she said, "Then he made me. He did it. You did not." There was something so dreadful about her expression. I'd left her before I meant to do it. I was standing before the fireplace, lighting a single candle in front of the tall mirror, and there suddenly I saw something which startled me, gathering out of the gloom first as a hideous mask, then becoming its three-dimensional reality, a weathered skull. I stared at it. It smelled faintly of the earth still, but had been scrubbed. "Why don't you answer me?" she was asking. I heard Lestat's door open. He would go out to kill at once, at least to find the kill. I would not. I would let the first hours of the evening accumulate in quiet, as hunger accumulated in me, till the drive grew almost too strong, so that I might give myself to it all the more completely, blindly. I heard her question again clearly, as though it had been floating in the air like the reverberation of a bell, and felt my heart pounding. "He did make me, of course," he said to himself. "But you hide something from..." "He did make me, of course. He said so himself. But you hide something from me, something he hints at when I question him. He says that it could not have been done without you." I found myself staring at the skull, yet hearing her as if the words were lashing me to make me turn around and face the lash. The thought went through me more like a flash of cold than a thought, that nothing should remain of me now but such a skull. I turned around and saw in the light from the street her eyes, like two dark flames in her white face, a doll whom someone had cruelly ripped the eyes and replaced them with demonic fire. A doll from whom someone had cruelly ripped the eyes and replaced them with a demonic fire. I found myself moving towards her, whispering her name. Some thought forming on my lips, then dying, coming towards her, then away from her, fussing for her coat and her hat. I saw a tiny glove on the floor which was phosphorescent in the shadow, and for just a moment I thought it a tiny severed hand. "What's the matter with you?" She drew nearer, looking up into my face. "What has always been the matter? Why do you stare at the skull like that? At the glove?" She asked this gently, but not gently enough. There was a slight calculation in her voice, an unreachable detachment. "I need you," I said to her, without wanting to say it. "I cannot bear to lose you. You're the only companion I have in immortality." "But surely there must be others. Surely we are not the only vampires on earth." I heard her say it as I had said it, heard my words coming back to me now on the tide of her self-awareness, her searching. But there's no pain, I thought suddenly. There's urgency, heartless urgency. I looked down at her. "Aren't you the same as I?" She looked at me. "You've taught me all I know." "Lestat taught you to kill." I fetched the glove. "Here, come. Let's go out. I want to go out." I was stammering, trying to force the gloves on her. I lifted the great curly mass of her hair and placed it gently over her coat. "But you taught me to see," she said. "You taught me the words, vampire eyes," she said. "You taught me to drink the world, to hunger for more than..." "I never meant those words that way. Vampire eyes," I said to her. "It has a different ring when you say it." She was tugging at me, trying to make me look at her. "Come," I said to her, "I've something to show you." And quickly I led her down the passage and down the spiral stairs through the dark courtyard. But I no more knew what I had to show her, really, than I knew where I was going. Only that I had to move forward. That I had to move toward it with a sublime and doomed instinct. We rushed through the early evening city, the sky overhead a pale violet now that the clouds were gone, the stars small and faint, the city around us as sultry and fragrant, the air around us sultry and fragrant, even as we moved away from the spacious gardens towards those mean and narrow streets where the flowers erupt in the cracks of the stones and the huge oleander shoots out thick, waxen stems of white and pink blooms, like a monstrous weed in the empty lots. I heard the staccato of Claudia's steps as she rushed beside me, never once asking me to slacken my pace, and she stood finally, her face infinitely patient, looking up at me in the dark and narrow street where a few old slope-roofed French houses remained among the Spanish facades, ancient little houses, the plaster blistered from the mouldering brick beneath. I had found the house now by a blind effort, aware that I had always known where it was and avoided it, always turned before this dark lampless corner, not wishing to pass the low window where I'd first heard Claudia cry. The house was standing still, sunk lower than it was in those days, the alleyway criss-crossed with sagging cords of laundry, the weeds high along the low foundation, the 2 dormer windows broken and patched with cloth. I touched the shutters. "It was here I first saw you," I said to her, thinking to tell it to her so she would understand, yet feeling now the chill of her gaze, the distance of her stare. "I heard you crying. You were there in a room with your mother, and your mother was dead. Dead for days, and you didn't know. You clung to her, whining, crying pitifully, your body white and feverish and hungry. You were trying to wake her from the dead. You were hugging her for warmth, for fear. It was almost morning, and..." I put my hand to my temples. I opened the shutters. I came into the room. I felt pity for you. Pity, but something else. I saw her lips slack, her eyes wide. "You fed on me," she whispered. "I was your victim." "Yes," I said to her. "I did it." There was a moment so elastic and painful as to be unbearable. She stood stark still in the shadows, her huge eyes gathering the light, the warm air rising suddenly with a soft noise, and then she turned. I heard the clicking of her slippers as she ran and ran and ran. I stood frozen, hearing the sound grow smaller and smaller, and then I turned, the fear in me unraveling, growing huge and insurmountable, and I ran after her. It was unthinkable that I not catch her, that I not overtake her at once and tell her that I loved her, must have her, must keep her, and every second that I ran headlong down the dark street after her was like her slipping away from me drop by drop. My heart was pounding, unfed, pounding and rebelling against the strain, until I suddenly came to a dead stop. She stood beneath a lamp-post, staring mutely, as if she didn't know me. I took her small waist in both hands and lifted her into the light. She studied me, her face contorted, her head turning as if she wouldn't give me her direct glance, as if she must deflect an overpowering feeling of revulsion. "You killed me," she whispered. "You took my life." "Yes," I said to her, holding her so that I could feel her heart pounding. "Rather, I tried to take it, to drink it away, but you had a heart like no other heart I've ever felt, a heart that beat and beat until I had to let you go, had to cast you away from me lest you quicken my pulse till I would die. And it was Lestat who found me out. Louis the sentimentalist, the fool, feasting on a golden-haired child, a holy innocent, a little girl. He brought you back from the hospital where they'd put you, and I never knew what he meant to do except teach me my nature. Take her, finish it, he said, and I felt that passion for you once again. Oh, I know I've lost you now forever. I can see it in your eyes. You look at me as you look on mortals, from aloft, from some region of cold self-sufficiency. I can't understand, but I did. I felt for you again, a vile, unsupportable hunger for your hammering heart, this cheek, this skin. You were pink and fragrant as mortal children are, sweet with the bite of salt and dust. I held you again, I took you again, and when I thought your heart would kill me and I didn't care, he parted us and, gashing his own wrist, gave it to you to drink. And drink you did, and drink until you nearly drained him and he was reeling. But you were a vampire then, and that very night you drank a human's blood, and have every night thereafter. Her face had not changed. The flesh was like the wax of ivory candles, only the eyes showed life. There was nothing more to say to her. I sat her down. I took your life, I said. He gave it back to you. And here it is, she said under her breath. And I hate you both. The vampire stopped. But why did you tell her? Asked the boy after a respectful pause. How could I not tell her? The vampire looked up in mild astonishment. She had to know it. She had to weigh one thing against the other. It was not as if Lestat had taken her full from life as he had taken me. I had stricken her. She would have died. There would have been no mortal life for her. But what's the difference? For all of us it's a matter of years, dying. So what she saw more graphically then was what all men know, that death will come inevitably unless one chooses this. He opened his white hands now and looked at his palms. And did you lose her? Did she go? Go? Where would she have gone? She was a child no bigger than that. Who would have sheltered her? Would she have found some vault like a mythical vampire, lying down with worms and ants by day, and rising to haunt some small cemetery and its surroundings? But that's not why she didn't go. Something in her was as akin to me as anything in her could have been. That thing in Lestat was the same. We could not bear to live alone. We needed our little company. A wilderness of mortals surrounded us, groping, blind, preoccupied, and the brides and bridegrooms of death. Locked together in hatred, she said to me calmly afterwards. I found her by the empty hearth, picking the small blossoms from a long stem of lavender. I was so relieved to see her there that I would have done anything, said anything, and when I heard her ask me in a low voice if I would tell her all I knew, I did this gladly, for all the rest was nothing compared to that old secret that I had claimed her life. I told her of myself as I've told you, of how Lestat came to me and went on the night. Of how Lestat came to me and what went on the night he carried her from the little hospital. She asked no questions and only occasionally looked up from her flowers, and then, when it was finished and I was sitting there, staring again at the wretched skull and listening to the soft slithering of the petals of the flowers on her dress, and feeling a dull misery in my limbs and mind, she said to me, I don't despise you. I wakened. She slipped off the high, rounded damask cushion and came towards me, covered with the scent of flowers, the petals in her hand. "Is this the aroma of mortal child?" she whispered. "Louis. Lover." I remember holding her and burying my head in her small chest, crushing her bird shoulders, her small hands working into my hair, soothing me, holding me. "I was mortal to you," she said, and when I lifted my eyes I saw her smiling, but the softness on her lips was evanescent, and in that moment she was looking past me like someone listening for faint, important music. "You gave me your immortal kiss," she said, though not to me, but to herself. "You loved me with your vampire nature." "I love you now with my human nature, if ever I had it," I said to her. "Ah, yes," she answered, still musing. "Yes, and that's your flaw. And why your face was miserable when I said, as humans say, 'I hate you,' and why you look at me as you do now. Human nature." I have no human nature, and no short story of a mother's corpse and hotel rooms where children learn monstrosity can give me one. I have none. Your eyes grow cold with fear when I say this to you. Yet I have your tongue, your passion for the truth, your need to drive the needle of the mind right to the heart of it all, like the beak of the hummingbird, who beats so wild and fast that mortals might think he had no tiny feet, could never set. What? Like the beak of the hummingbird, who beats so wild and fast that mortals might think he had no tiny feet, could never set, just go from quest to quest, going again and again for the heart of it. I am your vampire self more than you are, and now the sleep of 65 years has ended. The sleep of 65 years has ended. I heard her say it, disbelieving, not wanting to believe she knew and meant precisely what she'd said, for it had been exactly that since the night I tried to leave Lestat and failed, and, falling in love with her, forgot my teeming brain, my awful questions, and now she had the awful questions on her lips and must know. She'd strolled slowly to the centre of the room and strewn the crumpled lavender all around her. She broke the brittle stem and touched it to her lips, and having heard the whole story, said, "He made me then, to be your companion. No chains would have held you in your loneliness, and he could give you nothing. He gives me nothing. I used to think him charming. I liked the way he walked, the way he tapped the flagstones with his walking stick and swung me in his arms, and the abandon with which he killed, which was as I felt. But I no longer find him charming, and you never have, and we've been his puppets, you and I, you remaining to take care of him, and I your saving companion. Now's time to end it, Louis. Now's time to leave him." Time to leave him? I hadn't thought of it, dreamed of it in so long. I'd grown accustomed to him, as if he were a condition of life itself. I could hear a vague mingling of sounds now, which meant I had entered the carriageway, which meant he had entered the carriageway, that he would soon be on the back stairs, and I thought of what I always felt when I heard him coming. A vague anxiety, a vague need, and then the thought of being free of him forever rushed over me like water. I'd forgotten. Waves and waves of cool water. I was standing now, whispering to her that he was coming. "I know," she smiled. "I heard him when he turned the far corner." "But he'll never let us leave," I whispered. though I'd caught the implication of her words. Her vampire sense was keen. She stood on guard magnificently. "But you don't know him if you think he'll let us leave," I said to her, alarmed at her self-confidence. "He will not let us go." And she, still smiling, said, "Oh, really?" And that's where we'll leave it for today. Alright, that's another 10 pages of Interview with the Vampire. Let's see some of the interesting things that came up today. First thing is, at the outset of this little section, we have a note here on the faint credibility of vampire scholarship and literature within the text. The series in general has a really interesting relationship to traditional literary vampire depictions. But in Interview, it's a lot more played down. But there's still some interesting things to be looked at. Claudia is trying to find out about vampires here. And so one of the ways she goes about it is she starts to read through old occult texts and different books of scholarship. But also, very relevantly, she looks through old romantic stories, as Louis describes it. And she does all of this, but she doesn't get exceptionally far. It seems that there's kind of like an inch of truth to all of this mortal analysis of vampires, but most of the sources kind of miss the depiction, which matches up, because it feels here the narrative is doing, the kind of interesting thing where it's acknowledging that the vampires it has introduced are an amalgamation of prior vampire depictions, with some new additions added. And the way it does that is kind of cool, and it basically presents that probably every source has gotten a little bit right about vampires, but nothing perfectly has gotten absolutely everything spot on, unless it happens to be the book itself. Because a really cool thing that the series does, one of the best things about the Vampire Chronicles books I've read, I've only read the first 3. I've read Interview, I've read The Vampire Lestat, and I've read Queen of the Damned. I will attempt to remedy that in the future, but for now that's where I stand, is those books treat their predecessors as physical entities within the world. Because obviously Interview with the Vampire is a book that is framed in the format of being a created media, in which the boy interviewing is recording everything that's taken down. And the really, really cool thing the series does is that in the sequel, The Vampire Lestat, Interview with the Vampire is a book that has actually been published, and the characters are dealing with the aftermath of its publication, i.e. a book that actually just has everything right about vampires in it. And of course, the funny reality is that nobody realizes vampires are real from this book, because it is, after all, just another vampire book, and much like all its predecessors who weren't actually right, people just wrote it off as fiction. And then when Queen of the Damned comes out, The Vampire Lestat is an actual book that exists in its world. And again, people are reacting to that and dealing with its implications in fiction. So that's a really, really cool and unique thing that the series does that warrants a lot of analysis in and of itself. Obviously, it doesn't have much of a place in a reading of just Interview, which is what I'm doing here, but it's worth mentioning, and you should keep it in mind. Anyway, moving on. Some of the actual stuff that goes on with the characters in this section. A really interesting thing I noted down is that when Louis is talking to Claudia, Claudia uses the term vampire eyes, and this makes Louis quite uncomfortable. And my personal view on this, as to one of the reasons that this makes Louis uncomfortable, is because he is seeing reflected in Claudia the kind of reality of his own immoral hypocrisy. I think it's happened to everyone where, like, you believe something up until the point where you see someone else do or say it, and then all of a sudden seeing it in someone else gives you, like, a sense of perspective as to how wrong you were on a particular issue. I think this kind of happens to Louis in this instance. There are other arguments to be had regarding it, but I think personally, I like the idea that when Louis sees Claudia referring to vampire eyes and this notion of vampiric detachment, he is seeing a better executed reflection of the vampire he wants to be. And he realizes effectively that this is not a good thing. It's detached and inhuman and wrong. And it makes him quite uncomfortable. He never goes so far as to actively dislike the notion, but it makes him uncomfortable because he's having to face the reality of his own poorly founded view of the world. And particularly, he wants to keep Claudia from asking questions. And I talked about this in the previous bit where it's a mechanism for control. Because he wants to keep Claudia in a state of ignorant possession where he doesn't have to worry about her leaving him, essentially, or becoming independent of him. And, like, this is indicative of... It just puts forward Louis's hypocrisy in this regard. Because he keeps trying to keep Claudia from asking questions. At every turn, he tells Claudia, don't ask questions. You don't want to know the answer. I'm not going to tell you the answer. And then when he's talking to the interviewer asks her, like, did you tell her? He goes, yes, of course I told her. She had to know. But this is directly contradictory to what he had been saying all the time prior, where he had convinced himself that he wasn't going to tell her because it was better if she didn't know. So, like, he only actually told her when he had no choice. And then after the fact, he's obviously reasoned away that she had to know so that he can feel like he has the moral high ground in this regard. But it's just a nice little illustration of his hypocrisy, because he was keeping information from her as a mechanism of keeping her and controlling her. And then he tries to reason it and weasel it away that he was in the right after the fact. It's nonsensical. Now, Louis, when describing Louis's quote-unquote love for Claudia, a lot of the narratives, he basically kind of tries to claim he has this special vampire love for Claudia. I think he talks about it a bit more later in the novel. But the implication thus far is that he has this detached, non-human vampire love where he is her vampire lover, and that's different from a mortal lover. The problem I'm kind of having with this argument from Louis, and the comparison I kind of drew while I was reading through there, is this notion of special love is somewhat reminiscent of the narrative that child molesters try to push. You know, the notion that our love is unique and special, and that society wouldn't understand this true love that I feel for this individual. And the reality is that Louis' attraction to her is based off of her being a child. His first attraction to her begins when she was a mortal. He fed on her, a 5-year-old girl, and feeding in this series is most definitely analogous to sex. He has this pedophilic attachment to Claudia, and it is one of possession, most definitely, not love. He wants to own her, and he wants to create this system of possession in which, much like Lestat wants Louis to love him because he has no other choice, Louis wants Claudia to love him because she has no other choice. It is really, really uncomfortable. I do not buy their relationship as cute in any regard. Louis himself describes some of the physicality, the actions that Claudia takes, as sensual. And I understand what's being gone for here with the notion of she is mentally, quote unquote, older than she actually is. And so she has developed this independently. I think the first thing to say in response to that is that even if she mentally developed, she didn't physically develop. And so she never hit puberty. So sexually, I'm not sure where she would be on the whole spectrum of things. But I don't think that's a very good way to go about it by claiming she would just mentally develop normally. But more to the point, I think through Louis's eyes, we are seeing this 5-year-old child as sensual. The mind aside, he is seeing the body of a 5-year-old child as sensual. And never once does he see problem with this. I think that's one of the biggest problems here. Like, Louis has never once questioned or been concerned about the fact that he is finding himself honestly sexually attracted. Like, I think sexually attracted is the best word here to a 5-year-old child. And I think that's a really concerning narrative. And it definitely makes Louis a lot more of a villainous character than I think he's supposed to appear. His moral conflict instead becomes one of unquestioning hypocrisy in regards to his desire to possess and abuse Claudia through emotional manipulation. And one of the interesting things here is, like, does Claudia, quote unquote, love him back? I'm going to state very clearly here, I don't think any love is possible in this relationship, at least not in the sense of them being lovers. But I think there are two possibilities. The first is that Claudia has been kind of Stockholm syndromed into obsession with Louis in just the same way that Louis has been Stockholm syndromed into loving Lestat. I think there's a possibility in that, but I don't fully buy it. Claudia seems a lot more resourceful and cunning than Louis, and we already know that she's broken her detachment from Lestat, like her attachment from Lestat. She is more than happy to act against Lestat, so that gives me an indication that she is a lot more willing to basically break out of these situations, and a lot more willing to fight her own corner, essentially. And another possibility, I guess, and the one I think I kind of buy a bit more, and one that will be interesting to discuss a bit later in the novel, because I know Armand says a few things about this, I think, is the notion that Claudia doesn't love Louis, because Claudia is a vampire. Claudia is a much better vampire than Louis is. But Claudia recognizes that she needs Louis's money and she needs the protection that Louis offers. So she plays into this narrative of being his lover in order to effectively use him in order to survive. It's a survival mechanism, functionally. Because Louis himself remarks that Claudia would have nowhere to go if she just up and left. And I think that's fairly reasonable, because she is trapped in a child's body. And with that, she is very limited into how she can function in society. She probably can't just get on a boat of her own accord. She can't, like, buy property of her own accord. She can't go to balls on her own to feed, that kind of thing. She would be very limited in her ability to function in society without Louis. And so, effectively, what I think she's trying to do here is gain the upper hand on Louis so that she can use Louis for his money and protection and basically replace Lestat in his mind. When I was reading through it this time, I recently read Let the Right One In, and I was noticing a lot of parallels between this reading of the relationship of Louis and Claudia, and the dynamic between Hakan and Eli in Let the Right One In, where Hakan is a mortal pedophile who Eli, a child vampire, is basically using to operate in society for protection in order to be able to survive functionally. And potentially there's some inspiration for Let the Right One In to be found in Interview with the Vampire, because Let the Right One In came out in 2004, I think. So I think almost like Let the Right One In is perhaps a more honest depiction of this concept as it appears to be manifesting itself in this reading. I'm not saying there aren't other readings of the characters of Louis and Lestat and Claudia and their various dynamics. And I should note that in general, because I know a lot of people read Interview with the Vampire in a very, very different way to the way I'm reading it this time through. And I understand there are a lot of themes that people typically associate with this book that I haven't mentioned at all. And I'm not bringing in those themes because I don't think they exist and because I don't think they're important. I do think they exist and I do think they're important. I'm just going with what is coming to mind as I'm going through this book and formulating a kind of a new reading in my head of what this book means. And so that's kind of what's happened this time through. And that's why we're getting this very economically power dynamic, abuse-focused reading, because I think I've been reading a lot of the narratives very, very literally, because that's what they seem to be in their natural conclusions, in all honesty, this time through. Yeah. So that out of the way, I guess the only thing left to talk about in this particular section is the fact that Claudia is actually finally taking action where Louis never would have been able to properly. Louis got very close to potentially leaving Lestat, but we never find out if he would have actually followed through. Whereas Claudia has now just concluded that she and Louis are going to leave Lestat. And I guess most interestingly is that Claudia makes the decision of leaving Lestat for Louis, fundamentally. She decides that they're going to leave Lestat, and she's going to be the one that mainly puts into action the plan, which I think just further plays into my reading of Claudia as trying to position herself as a replacement for Lestat in the mind of Louis, so that she can, as a survival mechanism, use his wealth and social standing to operate in the world. So, anyway, that's another 10 pages. I hope you found this analysis interesting, and I will be back again tomorrow for some more of Interview with the Vampire. I'll see you then.